right, let's open our Bibles to Isaiah chapter 19. Isaiah 19. I'm going to try my best not to fall off here. I feel like I'm extremely high off the ground. I think y'all have a higher platform than we do at North Jackson. So I will just be very careful, but I trust we have enough helpful folks that if I fall down and hurt myself, somebody can come and help me with that. These are the prophecies or the oracles against the foreign nations. Israel is included, but we're not going to talk much about Israel because the assignment is the foreign nations, and it's chapters 13 through 23. Even though there are other places in the book where foreign nations are addressed, we're going to really focus our thoughts on these chapters. And of course, there's more in the chapters than we will have time to cover today. But this is, remember, a section of history where the focus is Assyria and Babylon. And so most of the punishments that God is meting out against these nations have to do with the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We're talking about kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, and then Sargon II, and Sennacherib, the kings who were operative during the time of Isaiah, and then the Babylonian kings who were yet in the future, whom Isaiah describes as coming against Judah. So this is the time period in which we're involved. And the Assyrians in particular are critical here, and they were very vicious warmongers. I want to just give you a flavor for the fearfulness that would have entered into the minds of the Israelites, especially King Ahaz and the leadership of Israel when Isaiah was working with them. This is not just an ordinary invading army. In fact, if you were to do a survey among historians of the most vicious conquering people ever to exist in the history of military operations, I guess the Assyrians would be right close to the top, although Babylon would not be far behind. I mean, there was even a king of Judah, Manasseh, who was led away into captivity with a hook in his nose, and that wasn't even the Assyrians. That was the Babylonians. So I don't exactly know how to rank these things. But let's notice something that was said in a helpful history of warfare by a man named Alexander Gillespie. And he wrote, "Survival as a slave or a distant colonist could not be expected if the captured were directly involved in leading wars against Assyria." So if they thought you were involved in fighting against them, then you were in trouble. These people could expect to be tortured, dismembered, killed, and horrifically displayed in public. For example, Sennacherib, whose army came against Hezekiah, and you can read about that in Isaiah 38 and 39, Sennacherib sometimes divided prisoners inside into those who led rebellions, who were hung on stakes around the city, those who had sinned lightly, who were carried away as slaves, and those who were not guilty of sin or contempt and were pardoned. However, at points, the distinction between the ill treatment of the ringleader prisoners and those who were effectively just the foot soldiers blurs, as everyone in the opposition is recorded as killed, regardless of level of complicity in the rebellion. Within this mix, torture and amputation, this is pretty nasty, isn't it? I'm sorry to have to read this to you, but I do think it's helpful to understand how severe this was. Other forms of mutilation, often by blinding and or castration, as well as removing the fingers of archers or the tongues of those who gave orders, are all recorded. The Assyrians also desecrated the dead. Tiglath-Pileser I repeatedly recorded the decapitation and stacking of the bodies or heads of the enemy dead, or having the skins of flayed victims spread upon the city wall. It's very terrifying. There's an inscription on a stela that was found in Iraq, and this is from just before the time of Isaiah, and it shows us that one of the Assyrian kings received tribute from Jehoash, king of Israel. Although that tribute is not exactly recorded, you do read of him making concessions in 2 Kings 13 to that king, and so it well probably was that he did pay the tribute, and so we have an extra biblical record of that. But we also have the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and that shows Jehoash, that's the king right there in the middle, who's bowing down to him. And that would reflect the biblical record of that, found at Assyria. And then you know about the Lachish relief, which is a huge wall display of Sennacherib's invasion of Judah, about which Isaiah counseled King Hezekiah. And on that you can see the people being impaled at the Battle of Lachish. And you can also see this would be the flaying that was mentioned a moment ago, where the people are strung up. Just very vicious militaristic efforts. And that's the backdrop of some of this judgment. The interesting thing is, the nations who are afflicted by Assyria are being given God's judgment, God's sentencing, and it is sentencing. These are not just events that happen that God foreknew. It is that God is bringing these events about as punishment. It doesn't mean that God directly caused the evil that's involved. I would recommend that you listen to Brother Jason's lecture from last hour about God not causing evil but foreknowing evil. That's an important distinction. But God is allowing these events to be orchestrated in such a way, and to whatever degree He's directly causing them, we're not sure. But God is orchestrating these events to bring about punishment. It's not just events, but it's sentencing. And we're reading about Assyria being an instrument of God's justice upon these wicked nations, but then Assyria itself being called into judgment, and that it will be destroyed by the Babylonians. Sometimes people are incapable of reconciling God's punishing people with God's goodness. This is just a general problem of which our subject today is an instance. Remember, Romans 11:22 says, "Behold the goodness and the severity of God." Everybody who's a Christian who believes what the Bible says has to uphold both of those things. That God's mercy endures forever, and that God will not clear the wicked. But there are a lot of people, especially those who are in the new atheist movement, and I think their influence is starting to wane. I'm hopeful that it is. But notice just a few quotations from people who look to passages like Isaiah 13-23 and conclude that this could not be the Christian God. And even some of them take a step further. These guys definitely take a step further and say that God could not exist at all. Just before I read the statements, remember Marcion, the heretic in the 2nd century, who was a member of the church at Rome and was disfellowshipped because he taught a bunch of false doctrines. One of his main false doctrines was that the God of the Old Testament was not the same as the God of the New Testament. He actually believed that there were two gods: the vengeful, wrathful God who would punish nations like we're about to consider in Isaiah, and then the loving God of Christianity. And he thought those two gods could not be the same God, so he thought that there were actually two beings that had been in competition with one another over the centuries. And the church rightly recognized that that was a false teaching, so they cast aside that doctrine. But isn't Marcionism in some form still with us today? Not that there are people who are going around claiming to be followers of his, but that people still have the idea that that Old Testament God who is punishing people and who's called jealous, and really it's righteous jealousy, that God could not be the same God who offers salvation through Christ. But if they believe that, then either they haven't read about all the love that God had in the Old Testament, or they haven't read about all the wrath that God promises in the New Testament. They're just not paying attention to the overall picture of God as presented in the Bible. But here are the statements I want to read to you. Richard Dawkins, in his 2006 book, The God Delusion, referred to God as a moral monster, talking about passages like we're going to consider today. Or Christopher Hitchens, in his book called God is Not Great, focused largely on the God of the Old Testament, and he said it contains, and I quote, "a warrant for trafficking in humans, for ethnic cleansing, for slavery, for bride price, and for indiscriminate massacre. But we are not bound by any of it because it was put together by crude and uncultured human animals." He said that the 10 Commandments were, and I quote, "proof that religion is man-made." What a shame. And then Daniel Dennett, in his book called Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, in 2006, wrote that the Old Testament God was merely a superman who could, and I quote, "take sides in battles and be both jealous and wrathful. Part of what makes Jehovah such a fascinating participant in stories of the Old Testament is his king-like jealousy and pride and his great appetite for praise and sacrifices. But we have moved beyond this God, haven't we? He says. Well, those things that he mentions are actually true of God, but if God is really who he says he is, then he is deserving of worship. And he has a right to claim our allegiance, and he has the prerogative to kill people when he wants to kill them. Always remember that God is uniquely sovereign over human life. And whenever God says that life should end, that a person's biological life should end, that's not an evil thing. In fact, God sets a human lifespan for all of us, according to Psalm 90, that we live 70 or 80 years. It is up to God, who is the judge of all the earth, who will always do right, Genesis 18:25, to determine how long anybody's biological life should last, whether it's somebody from Assyria or Edom or the United States of America. God gets to decide that, and he's not to be blamed for it. He's the giver of biological life, and he is unique in that way. Nobody else is, only God. And God gets to determine how long a person's life should last. We could say a lot about that, but we just need to remember that from the days of Noah, when God decided that the lives of all those people should end, to the time of the Assyrians, to today, God is sovereign over human life. And respect him in that way. And say that if God says my life should last this amount of time, then that's up to him. It may be painful for me, but God is God and I'm not. That God knows what's best. And he always has drawn limits. As Paul says in Acts 17, he sets the boundaries of our habitations, including the amount of time we should live. So here we have an account of God saying, I've run out of my patience for these people. He actually pronounces punishment on 10 nations. And you know, I'm reflecting on the United States of America in my own mind as I read these things. And I'm hoping that our situation is that God will allow us to remain in the same way that he would have allowed Sodom to remain if there were but 10 righteous people in it. And we got a lot more than 10 righteous people just in this room. And we have thousands of brethren who are faithful and strong and devoted to the Lord. And that may be why God has not allowed the United States, with much evil that exists in it, to be overrun by people even in our own time. So, let's notice three things from this passage. The first is going to be that God is not a respecter of persons. The second is that God rules over the kingdoms of men. And the third is that God specifically punishes, sentences, wicked nations. So those three ideas, and then the lesson will be yours. The first thing is that God is not a respecter of persons. All of these nations, pagan nations, receive God's punishment, and so does Israel, so does Judah, and everybody is accountable to live according to God's law, whichever law applied to them. I trust that everybody in here knows the difference between the patriarchal dispensation and the Mosaic dispensation and the Christian age. But in every case, as Peter says in Acts 10:34, whoever comes to God and does what's right is welcomed by him. That he's not a respecter of persons, but in every nation under heaven, people can come to God on the same terms under Christ. The Gentiles are included, just like Cornelius was in that context, on the same standard as Jews or anybody else. But in principle, whether you're talking about the law of Moses or the patriarchal age, everybody has always been accountable to do the same thing, which is to obey the law of God that is revealed to them. And in the Mosaic age, it was to the people who came out of Egypt, specifically Deuteronomy 5:1-2. The 10 Commandments were not given to everybody. Nobody living today will be saved because they failed to keep the 10 Commandments. And nobody living today will be lost because they failed to keep them, or saved because they did keep them. We're under the law of Christ today, 1 Corinthians 9:21 and Galatians 6:2. The Israelites were under that law. But the rest of the world was not under the law of Moses. The rest of the world was not included in that group of people who came out of Egypt, who were descendants of Jacob. So these foreign nations were not amenable to the law of Moses. What were they amenable to? They were under patriarchy, or the law that was given to God through the fathers that was a moral code. Many of those moral principles were ensconced in the Ten Commandments and the law of Moses, but they were serving under those principles of morality that were given to, beginning with Abraham, beginning even before that with Adam, and then Noah. People who died in the Noah flood were people who had rebelled against God's law of morality. We might wish we could know more about exactly what God expected of these Gentile people, but they had a law written on their hearts, Romans 2:14. They were accountable. So in every generation, it's been possible for people to do God's will and to be approved by Him. God had expectations for every nation, regardless of how much written revelation they had, how much has come down to us over time in terms of what God told them through the prophets, regardless of that. And we know that Old Testament prophets communicated with these people, from Obadiah and Nahum and Jonah and Isaiah here as we read, and Ezekiel and so on. There was much revelation to these people. God had made His will known, and they had rejected it. So notice Isaiah 19, beginning in verse 19. This is part of the oracle against Egypt. And I'm picking this one out just to show that this section of Scripture is not just doom and gloom, but rather there is promise of ultimate redemption. Notice what it says. In that day, I'm going to put it on the slide here for you, there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord near its border. It will become a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, for they will cry to the Lord because of oppressors, and He will send them a Savior and a champion, and He will deliver them. Thus the Lord will make Himself known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. They will even worship with sacrifice and offering, and will make a vow to the Lord and perform it. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking but healing, so they will return to the Lord, and He will respond to them and heal them. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrians will come into Egypt, and the Egyptians into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. In that day, Israel will be the third party with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. Well, that's amazing to think about, these opponents of Israel to their south, who had kept them in bondage for 400 years, back in the days of following Joseph. And then these opponents of Israel in the north, the Assyrians, and they were the big threat when Isaiah was working. And now they're all worshiping together as one group. When would that be possibly fulfilled? That would be when this Savior comes, who Isaiah mentions, when all people who are right with God are worshiping in the same way and are part of the same family. So God is not a respecter of persons. Remember this, whenever God prophesies against the nations, there is the national fate, but that could be distinguished from individual fate. That it could be that Israel is being punished by Babylon, for example, in captivity, but that doesn't mean that Jeremiah is lost, or that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are lost. So there can be faithful people who are in the midst of a nation, part of a nation that's being punished by another. And also remember that even though a nation's being punished in the present, God can still bring about the eventual salvation of any people He wants to under a different system, which Christ will bring in. One of the sweetest invitations for all people is in Revelation 22:17, where we read, The Spirit and the bride say, Come. Let him who thirsts drink of the water of life without price. That's a quotation from guess what book? Isaiah chapter 55 and verse 1. And do we have that perspective in our congregations? That the water of life is offered to people in our community without price, and that anybody is welcome to it? Suppose someone comes in from a different socioeconomic background. Would we think that probably the water of life is not available to him? Or somebody who's of a different skin color, or somebody who has come from another country or something? I hope that we have the attitude that this is truly, the Lord's church is truly an international organization, that it is for all people regardless of their background. And we welcome all, and we uphold the same standard for all, regardless of their background. One more passage before we move on. Look at Isaiah 13, verse 6. The Lord is going to punish the earth. This shows that all are subject to the same ultimate standard of judgment. So we've seen in chapter 19, the blessing of salvation is for all, for the Assyrian, the Egyptian, for the Israelite. But on the other side of that coin is that the same punishment is available to all. This just shows God is not a respecter of person. God looks at the heart, 1 Samuel 16:7. God judges our hearts, Proverbs 21 and verse 2. He is not looking at external superficialities, like how much money we have, or what our skin color is, or who our political leaders are. He's looking at us individually, at our hearts, the decisions that we make, and He's calling us to His morality. Wail, God says, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. They will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming. The day of the Lord in the Bible typically refers to the day of judgment, or a day of judgment on a particular nation, with fury and burning anger to make the land a desolation. And He will exterminate its sinners from it. From the stars of heaven for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. This is apocalyptic language where some catastrophic event is being referred to with astronomical language. And that happens repeatedly through the Bible, especially with the fall of a ruler. We'll see that in chapter 14 with the fall of the monarchy of Babylon, which is referred to as a star that's falling down from the heavens, a Lucifer. Okay, thus I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will also put an end to the arrogance of the proud and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. Okay, so that's our first point, which is that God is not a respecter of persons. And I'm thankful for that, because I'm a Gentile. And I'm glad that God opened the door to Gentiles to have full fellowship with Jews on the same standard of obedience, that I need to do exactly what a Jewish person needs to do to obey God. And I don't have to become a Jew before I can be a Christian. That was the problem of the early church, that there were those in the church who were saying you had to go through Judaism to be a Christian. You had to follow some part of the law of Moses before you could be right with God, and that's not the case. In the Christian age, everybody comes in to the fellowship of the saints on the same terms. Okay, number 2. God rules in the kingdoms of men. That is surely obvious from our passage. This doesn't mean that God decides who the leader of any particular group of people is going to be, like God is putting His direct finger on every election that happens. God is not necessarily in control, but God is in charge. You see the difference? That God is in charge of everything, that anything that happens only because God allows it to happen. But that doesn't mean that God is in control of everything. If God were in control of everything, then He would be implicated in moral evil. Because every time somebody sinned, it would be God's fault. Because God made the person to sin, but James 1:13 and 14 says that God doesn't do that. If somebody dies in a traffic accident because there was a drunk driver, is it God's fault? Well, God never wanted anybody to drink alcohol to begin with. Ephesians 5:18, 1 Peter 4:2 and 3. God didn't want that to happen. God allows it to happen because God doesn't intervene in every case before something bad happens. And that introduces a whole different lesson about how God is justified in the face of terrible things that happen. And we could do that lesson, but we're not going to do it right now. But I just bring up this to say God is in charge, and sometimes He shows more or less degrees of control. And to whatever degree God did control what happened here, we know from Isaiah's prophecy that these are punishments that God wanted to come upon these people. And God even wanted His own people to be punished to refine them, so that they would not be idolatrous anymore. I mean, just think about it. God sent his people into Babylonian captivity, as Isaiah prophesies in chapter 39 when he brings the punishment on Hezekiah, because Hezekiah showed the Babylonian envoy all of his treasures to Esarhaddon and so forth. So Isaiah shows them the treasures, and then God says, there's going to be Babylonian captivity for you, not in your generation. But after the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites don't worship idols anymore because of purification has taken place. When Jesus is on the earth, there are lots of problems among the Jews, but idolatry is not one of them. They do not worship the idols anymore. And so there's a growth that occurs through the suffering, and we all should grow as a result of the suffering that comes in our lives. God rules and decides who's going to be in charge in these cases, and he always has that prerogative. He doesn't necessarily sway every election that occurs. We don't know how God may be doing that. Those matters are unknown to us, but Daniel 4:25 says that God reigns among the kingdoms of men and bestows them upon whoever he will. That is in a context of Daniel's prophecy about kingdoms that would come and go. And God has the prerogative of putting anybody in charge he wants to. So let's read a little bit just to get ourselves a flavor of this from our context in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 3 to 4. It says, "And it will be in the day when the Lord gives you rest and from your pain and turmoil and harsh service in which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased and how fury has ceased." Well, this is the part about the Babylonians being destroyed by the Medo-Persian Empire and the fall of Lucifer, the king of Babylon. It is the case that the devil seems to have been a fallen angel, 2 Peter 2:4, Jude 6 and 7, but this is not about him. This is about a king who could be buried and who could even be eaten by worms. This is about the fall of a kingdom, and God is behind it. So God rules in the kingdoms of men, and we should take great comfort in that whoever may be in charge of the country where we live at different times, whoever may be on a throne in a country where we have loved ones, God is over and above all that. That we are on the side of the one who is in total charge. And he may allow us to suffer on this earth, but remember, that's just a fleeting, it's but for a moment. 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. And God, through all of the problems of life, is working for us an exceeding and eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, so that whatever political rulers may do in this world, we have something coming for us that will make any suffering we undergo, even persecution that we undergo, as we surely will, 2 Timothy 3:12, any of that trouble will just pale into infinitesimal insignificance. Think about how long we will be in heaven. It's hard to even say that it will be a long time, because in comparison to what? It will just never end. It will be so long. And so every day we're in heaven, apparently, the sufferings of this life just become so insignificant. Even as terrible as they are seeming right now, and I don't want to minimize anybody's suffering, it will just be like nothing because of how great it will be there. And even from day one in heaven, well, it's just one eternal day, so day one is not right to say. It's really hard to talk about heaven. But even from the very beginning of it, it will be so glorious to be there that it will be undefiled. 1 Peter 1:3 and 4. There will never be anything in heaven that will make it any worse than what it is. And maybe God will wipe some memories away from our minds. Revelation 21:4 makes it seem like that's a possibility. But maybe just being in the presence of God will be so overwhelming that suffering in this life will just not be relevant at all. And maybe even loved ones who are lost will not seem relevant to us, because it will be so overwhelmingly powerful to be with Jesus in that place of bliss. I don't know how God's going to work it out, but he will certainly work it out so that we will be happy and we can trust him. In the same way that we tell our children about some good thing that's going to happen and they're wondering about how it's going to work, we just want to tell them, trust us, you'll like it. You will enjoy it. Maybe we're going to go on a trip somewhere and they're wanting to know all the details. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And they want to know everything that's going to happen. And I can't really explain. If we're going somewhere new, if we're going to take them somewhere that's going to be really exciting, I can't explain exactly how it's going to be. I can just say, trust us, you'll like it. There will be no problem with you liking it. And we want to say the same thing about heaven, that we don't know all the details, but we will like it. Well, that's a different sermon, but that's in the backdrop, that God can work all things together for good, Romans 8:28, and that He will never leave us or forsake us, Hebrews 13:5. That is in the backdrop when we read about all this catastrophe that will happen with all of these nations. A lot of frightening things are in these passages, and we could look at similar situations and say there's a lot of upheaval in the world, there are a lot of problems, but we have something on the other side. And that even comes to the fore in our passages today, because God does have different times where He mentions the ultimate hope of all these people. So let's look at the nations then. We're ready to talk about the specific sentencing of these nations in the last time that we have together. But look at Isaiah 10:5 and 6. This is about Assyria. It says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation and commission it against the people of my fury to capture booty and to seize plunder and to trample them down like mud in the streets." So God says Assyria is going to punish, but it's going to be punished as well. What I've given you is a chart. We'll walk through this chart and just look at God's sentencing of these different nations. The first of them being Babylon. Babylon's going to be thrown down. There's more detail given in Jeremiah 51 about the overthrow of Babylon in 539 BC by the Medo-Persian Empire, but it happened at night when there was a drunken feast going on and nobody was really paying attention to the forces of Cyrus that came in and took the land. But Babylon would be overthrown. Assyria would be overthrown. And that happened at the Battle of Nineveh when they were defeated by Nebuchadnezzar and his forces. Philistia would be snake-bitten, and Isaiah mentions that smoke would come up, and actually Ashkelon was burned in the invasion of the land, and so that prophecy came exactly true. Moab would be undone, and the Moabites, by the way, are the most persistent foe, I think, of the Israelites in the whole Old Testament. And that all came from Lot having an unlawful relationship with one of his daughters in Genesis 19. The son was named Moab, and the Moabites were always a thorn in the Israelite side. I could be wrong. There might be one that's worse, about maybe the Philistines, but I don't think the Philistines were even as bad as the Moabites were. But notice what God says about the Moabites in chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. It says, "This is the word which the Lord spoke earlier concerning Moab. But now the Lord speaks, saying, within 3 years, as a hired man would count them, the glory of Moab will be degraded, along with all his great population, and his remnant will be very small and impotent." And indeed, Sennacherib does record that the Moabites submitted to him. So this did come true. And then Damascus, according to chapter 17, would be snake-bitten. Damascus, the Syrian Empire, was defeated by the Babylonians in 732 BCE. Cush is probably Ethiopia, and we find that they are going to bring gifts to the Lord in this passage, and the gifts may refer to 1 Chronicles 32, where various nations brought presents to Hezekiah after the Assyrians were defeated. I think they wanted to curry favor with the Israelites after 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died in one night as the angel of the Lord came and destroyed them. So lots of nations brought gifts, and so that's probably what's being referred to here. But then it also might be the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, and that would be the first convert, so far as we know, who lived on the African continent. So maybe that's referred to as a spiritual gift that people would begin to bring from that part of the world. Egypt would be given to a hard master, and remember, the Egyptians were the hard masters of the Israelites. So there's a great deal of irony in the passage about Egypt and Cush going into captivity, and the Assyrians did conquer Egypt in 677 BCE. And then the Edomites were afflicted by a variety of nations. We know about the Assyrians and Babylonians fighting against them. We don't know for sure what the Greeks did to them, but the Greeks conquered that whole region. And then by the time the Romans conquered the region, the Edomites just went away. You don't read about Edomites anymore, with the exception of some descendants of the Edomites being in Israel, like the Herodian bloodline at the time of Christ. But as a separate nation, the Edomites just ceased to exist at that point. And then the Arabians, well, we don't know too much about what happened to the Arabian tribes, but they were subjugated by the Babylonians. And Tema is a very important city to the Arabians that's mentioned in the passage. And by the way, it was the capital to which Nabonidus went when Belshazzar ruled as his co-regent. And Belshazzar was the one who was ruling when Babylon was conquered in 539. He was the king who had the handwriting on the wall. Well, Nabonidus, his dad, was off ruling from that place, Tema, and that's mentioned in this passage. Israel will skip over because this is an assignment to deal with the foreign nations, and then Tyre was going to be laid waste. Tyre is very interesting because of Ezekiel's prophecy in Ezekiel 26, which gives much more detail about what would happen to them. And I'll just give you a summary because it's one of the outstanding cases of detailed biblical foreknowledge in the entire Old Testament. In fact, Ezekiel and Isaiah look about 1,800 years into the future to prophesy what all would happen to Tyre, and it includes not only Nebuchadnezzar fighting for 13 years against Tyre. Tyre had two sections, a mainland portion and an island portion. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had no navy, so he fought against the mainland portion and basically conquered it, but the people fled to the island portion, and so Nebuchadnezzar sort of conquered Tyre, but not really. Remember, Isaiah and Ezekiel prophesied that many nations would come against Tyre, and that's certainly true. Alexander the Great fought against Tyre in 332, and he took the rubble from the mainland portion that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered and built a causeway. He built a bridge out of junk and was able to go out and conquer the island portion. And so he pretty well subjugated the land. There were still people who lived there until 1291, when finally the Muslims came and destroyed it completely. And after that, it never was rebuilt. And that's exactly what was prophesied about this land, is that it would never be rebuilt. And you can actually still see, if the water is clear enough, you can see the ancient city of Tyre underwater. If you look on Google Maps, there is a city of Tyre, but that's not the ancient city. It's underwater. And so certainly was never rebuilt. An interesting thing is that Ezekiel prophesied that Tyre would be swept clean like a bare rock, and that it would only be a place for fishermen where they could stand on that bare rock and fish from there. Well, Alexander the Great did sweep it clean like a bare rock in order to build his causeway, and then there is historical record of people fishing from there. It was like a little fishing village on that rock. Well, that just shows you the great detail of a biblical prophet looking 1,800 years in the future and saying, here's what's going to happen to one of these places. And as we look at it from our own perspective, the question for the passage is not, are we worried about what's going to happen to Egypt or Cush or Tyre or Moab? Because these places are long past. The point for us is that God keeps His word. Remember, Numbers 23:19 says that God is not a man that He should lie. Has He not spoken? And will He not do it? And people today who think they can live in opposition to Christ and ignore God's word, and that God will not judge them, need to look carefully not just at this passage but at others. 2 Thessalonians 1:8 and 9 says that God is going to come in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who know not God and who obey not the gospel. If God kept His word about Egypt and about Moab and Assyria and Tyre, these are just examples to help us see that God is going to do the judgment that He says He is going to do. I wonder if on the judgment day, I don't know exactly what would happen, but do you think it would be appropriate on the judgment day for God to look at people who ignored His word in the present day and say, didn't I show you when I prophesied exactly what would happen to Tyre, that in promising judgment, I would keep my word? Why did you not pay attention to that? And if I said, here are the rules for the road. Here's how a person should live. If I gave you the last will and testament of Jesus Christ, and you didn't respect the last will and testament of Christ in the pages of Scripture enough to keep it in your own heart, in your own family, in the way you managed your money, in the way you prioritized your schedule, in the way you worshiped, in the church you attended, if you did not respect my will enough, why did you not think that I would not keep my word? And even if God doesn't say words like that, and certainly He can say whatever He wants to say on the day of judgment, but even if God doesn't say words like that, you and I would have an eternity to think about words like that. Because whatever we've heard in the pages of Scripture in a passage like this, that will be haunting us for an eternity if we don't humbly submit to Him and say, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears. And here I am, Lord, send me," like Isaiah said. Well, you've been very kind to listen. I'm out of time, and thank you for your study of Isaiah, and keep it up, and I hope this book will bless your life from here on out.